What was a medieval livery? At its simplest, it was a uniform. It was a set of clothes, usually a tunic or a coat, that showed who you worked for. If you saw a man in a blue and white tunic walking down a street in 15th century England, you knew he belonged to the Duke of Norfolk. If you saw another man with the badge of a bear and a ragged staff sewn onto his sleeve, you knew he was a follower of the Earl of Warwick. It was a visual sign, it declared loyalty. It was a walking billboard for a powerful man. But it was more than just clothes. The word itself tells us more. Livery comes from the old French word livry, which means something delivered. This is the real key to understanding it. Livery was what a lord delivered to his followers in exchange for their service. This delivery could be clothes, yes, but it could also be food and drink. It could be lodging in his castle. It could be a yearly payment of money, or even fuel for your fire. Livery was the physical stuff you received for being in a lord's service. It was the tangible part of a contract. The lord provided for you, and in return, you provided loyalty, work, and, when needed, muscle. This system grew out of an older way of doing things. In the earlier Middle Ages, a lord might grant a knight a piece of land, a manor, in exchange for military service. This was the core of feudalism, but as time went on, society changed. Money became more important than land. A powerful lord found it easier and more flexible to pay his followers with cash, food, and clothing rather than carving up his estates. He could hire as many men as he could afford, he could raise a force quickly and dismiss it when he was done. This new system, sometimes called bastard feudalism, relied heavily on livery. The uniform, the badge, the daily allowance of bread and ale, and these were the signs of this new, more fluid kind of loyalty. So, the livery tunic wasn't just a piece of clothing, it was a symbol of a whole relationship. For the man wearing it, it meant security. It meant he had a patron, a protector. He would be fed, housed, and paid. If he got into a brawl in a tavern, his lord's influence might get him out of trouble. His lord was supposed to maintain him, not just with provisions, but with legal and physical protection. In a world with no police force and a shaky justice system, this was incredibly valuable. Having a powerful lord at your back was the best insurance policy you could get. For the lord giving it, livery was a display of power. The more men you had wearing your colors, the more important you were. When a great magnate like John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, traveled, he moved with a huge retinue of hundreds of men, all wearing his famous Lancastrian colors. This was a spectacle. It was a traveling army, a mobile court. It sent a clear message to rivals, to the local population, and even to the king: I am a man of consequence. I have hundreds of loyal men ready to do my bidding. A lord's power was not just in his lands or his castles. It was visible in the number of liveried retainers he could put on the street. It was a currency of influence and intimidation. The uniform wasn't just fabric and thread, it was woven with power, loyalty, and the constant threat of violence. It was the skin of a social and political system that defined the later Middle Ages. The idea of livery was not one single thing. It was a system with different levels and types, all based on that core idea of a lord delivering, something in exchange for service. The most visible part was the livery of color. This was the uniform itself. A lord would choose a set of colors for his household, often based on the main colors of his coat of arms. The Percy family, Earls of Northumberland, used russet, yellow, and blue. The House of York used blue and murrey, a dark reddish purple. Their retainers would be given tunics or jackets in these colors, often divided vertically or quarterly. The cloth would be bought in huge quantities, and the lord's household would employ tailors to make the garments. It was a major expense, but a necessary one for a lord wanting to project his power. And beyond color, there was the livery of the badge. This was a specific symbol associated with a lord or his family. It was different from a coat of arms, which was a complex design meant for the battlefield and for sealing documents. A badge was simpler, more like a modern logo. Richard III's badge was a white boar. The Earl of Oxford's was a star, or mullet. The Duke of Buckingham's was the Stafford knot. These badges would be embroidered onto the livery garments or made from metal, usually lead or pewter for common retainers, and sometimes silver or gold for more important followers. A man might wear his lord's badge pinned to his hat or his coat. This was an even clearer sign of allegiance than just colors. The badge was a personal mark of the lord himself. To wear it was to be his man, publicly and without question. These two types of livery, color, and badge were often given to a wide range of people. They weren't just for full-time soldiers. A lord's household staff, from his steward and treasurer down to the cooks and grooms, would wear his livery. So would the musicians who played in his hall, but it also extended outside the household. A lord would give his livery to local gentlemen, mayors, lawyers, and officials who he wanted in his network of influence. These were his well-willers, or his friends in the region. They might not be on his payroll every day, but by accepting his livery, they were agreeing to support his interests. This is where the system got really powerful and really messy. This brings us to the most significant part of the system, livery and maintenance. We've talked about livery, the delivery of goods. Maintenance was the other side of the coin. It meant to support or back someone, particularly in a legal dispute. When a retainer wearing a lord's badge got into trouble, he expected his lord to maintain his cause. This could mean the lord would send his lawyers to defend the man in court. Or it could mean the lord would show up to the trial with 100 armed men in his livery, standing in the back of the courtroom to intimidate the jury and the judge. This was a perversion of justice, and it was one of the biggest problems with the livery system. Justice was no longer about right and wrong, it was about who had the more powerful protector. The whole system was essentially a contract. The retainer promised to be the lord's man. He would ride with him, fight for him, wear his colors, and support his political ambitions. In return, the lord provided the livery, the pay, the food, the uniform, and the maintenance, the protection. For full-time retainers, this was a lifelong commitment. They were called household retainers, and they lived with the lord, ate at his table, and formed the core of his personal army. For part-time followers, it was more like a retainer fee. A local knight might be paid a yearly sum to be on call when the lord needed him. He would wear the lord's livery on special occasions to show his allegiance. This created vast networks of affinity and loyalty that crisscrossed the country, all held together by payments, promises, and the simple, powerful symbol of the livery. In practice, livery shaped daily life and the political landscape of the later Middle Ages. Imagine walking through a busy town like York or Coventry in the 1450s. The streets would be a sea of color, but not just from market stalls or ladies' dresses. The real color came from the liveries of the great lords and their followers. You would see groups of men in the Percy Russet swaggering past a tavern. Moments later, a group in the Neville family's colors might come down the same street. The tension would be immediate and obvious. Everyone knew who belonged to whom. The liveries were like gang colors, defining territory and signaling potential conflict. This visual language of power had a profound effect on society. For an ordinary person, a liveried retainer was someone to be wary of. These men were often arrogant, knowing they had the protection of a powerful magnate. They were the lord's enforcers. If a lord had a dispute over a piece of land, he wouldn't necessarily go to court. He might just send a few dozen of his liveried men to occupy the land, evict the rival claimant, and rough up anyone who resisted. The famous Passon letters, a collection of correspondence from a gentry family in Norfolk, are full of stories like this. The Passons were constantly in disputes with their more powerful neighbors, and they lived in fear of seeing the Duke of Norfolk's men, in their blue and white, appear on the horizon to seize one of their manors. This system of private power directly challenged the authority of the king. While the king had his own livery for his household, he couldn't compete with the combined forces of his great nobles. A powerful duke might have more men under his personal livery than the king had in his immediate bodyguard. These private armies, or retinues, were the building blocks of the major conflicts of the era, most notably the Wars of the Roses. That conflict was not at its heart a war between the people of Yorkshire and the people of Lancashire. It was a feud between the great noble houses, a dynastic struggle fought by their private armies of liveried retainers. When the Duke of York or the Earl of Warwick called their banners, they were calling upon the thousands of men who had accepted their livery and pay. Knights, gentlemen, and common archers would rally to their lord's side. They fought not for a national cause, but for their patron. They wore his livery badge into battle. At the Battle of Barnet in 1471, a dense fog caused a disastrous mistake. The Earl of Oxford's men fighting for the Lancastrian side had a star as their badge. The Earl of Warwick's men, fighting on the same side, had a sun with streams as their badge. In the fog, Warwick's archers mistook Oxford's star for the sun and splendor, badge of their Yorkist enemy, King Edward IV. They fired on their own allies. Oxford's men, thinking they had been betrayed, fled the field. This confusion, born from the simple symbols of livery badges, may have cost the Lancastrians the battle and, ultimately, the war. Livery wasn't just for the battlefield. It was a tool for political control. During parliamentary elections, a great lord would ensure his chosen candidate won by flooding the town with his liveried followers. They would intimidate voters and officials, making sure the right man was elected to represent the lord's interests in parliament. The system created a country run not by a central government, but by a collection of regional power brokers, each with his own private army and political machine. This was the world of bastard feudalism, and livery was its uniform. It fostered a fierce personal loyalty to a local lord, often at the expense of loyalty to the crown or the concept of a nation. For the men wearing it, livery was a source of identity and security. But for the kingdom as a whole, it was a recipe for anarchy, violence, and civil war. The kings of England were not blind to the dangers of livery. For centuries, the crown fought a long, slow battle to control it. The problem was simple. The very nobles the king relied on to govern the country and fight his wars abroad were the ones with the largest and most disruptive private armies at home. Banning livery entirely was almost impossible. It would be like a modern government trying to ban all forms of corporate branding. It was too deeply embedded in the social and political fabric. Early attempts at regulation were weak and full of loopholes. In the 14th century, laws were passed forbidding the giving of livery for the purpose of maintenance, that is, for intimidating law courts. But these laws were difficult to enforce. How could you prove that a lord's men were in court to intimidate the jury and not simply to show support for their master? The nobles were powerful, and they sat in the parliament that made the laws. They made sure to include exceptions that protected their own interests. For instance, a lord was usually allowed to give livery to his own household servants, his estate officials, and his legal counsel. This created an obvious loophole. A lord who wanted to maintain a force of 100 fighting men could simply claim they were all members of his household or his council. He would put them on the books as ushers, clerks, or legal advisors, even if their real job was to be ready with a sword and bow when he called. The system was a constant cat-and-mouse game between the king and his magnates. The king would pass a law, and the nobles would immediately find a way around it. Richard II tried to crack down hard on livery, which was one of the reasons his powerful nobles eventually turned on him and deposed him. His successor, Henry IV, who had come to the throne with the help of these same nobles, had to be more careful. He passed his own laws against livery, but the problem persisted throughout the 15th century, fueling the violence of the Wars of the Roses. The real change came with the Tudor dynasty, starting with Henry VII in 1485. Henry had won the throne at the Battle of Bosworth Field, ending the Wars of the Roses. He knew firsthand the destructive power of the great nobles and their private armies. His entire reign was focused on one goal: breaking the power of these over mighty subjects and establishing the absolute authority of the crown. He used a two-pronged approach. First, he enforced the old laws against livery with a new and ruthless vigor. Second, he used his own special court, the Court of Star Chamber, to punish offenders without the risk of a local jury being intimidated. There is a famous story that illustrates Henry VII's methods perfectly. The king went to visit the Earl of Oxford, one of his most loyal supporters during the wars. To honor the king's visit, the earl had all his retainers, dressed in his fine livery, line the route to his castle. Henry thanked the earl for the splendid reception, but then he asked how many of these men were his household servants. The earl proudly admitted that they were his liveried retainers hired for the occasion. The king's face grew stern. He informed the earl that, while he was grateful for the show of loyalty, the earl had broken the laws against livery. The Earl of Oxford was hit with an enormous fine, worth millions in today's money. The message was brutally clear: not even the king's closest friends were above the law. The old way of doing things was over. Henry VII and his son Henry VIII didn't ban livery outright. They understood its importance for marking the status of a nobleman's household. What they banned was the keeping of large bands of military retainers under the guise of livery. The fines were so crippling that the nobles simply couldn't afford to maintain private armies anymore. Slowly, over the course of the Tudor period, the military aspect of livery faded away. A nobleman might still have his household staff and his colors, but he no longer had a private army on standby. The state was gradually gaining a monopoly on violence. The power of the great feudal lords was broken, and the power of the central government, embodied by the king, was supreme. The battle against livery was a key part of this long and difficult transition from a fractured medieval kingdom to a unified early modern state. Even after its military power was broken by the Tudors, the idea of livery did not disappear. Instead, it transformed. It shed its connection to private warfare and evolved into new forms that are still recognizable today. The core concept, a uniform or a symbol to show you belong to a particular group, proved to be incredibly durable. It just found new groups to represent. One of the most important new homes for livery was in the cities, particularly with the great trade guilds of London. These organizations, like the mercers' dealers in fine cloth, the goldsmiths, or the fishmongers, were powerful economic and social institutions. They began to adopt their own formal liveries to distinguish their members. To be a full member of a guild, a liveryman, was a sign of status and professional achievement. They would wear special gowns, often trimmed with fur, in the guild's colors for processions, feasts, and civic ceremonies. These were not the liveries of a feudal lord, but of a corporate body. They signaled allegiance not to a man, but to a trade and a city. The livery companies, as they came to be called, became a central part of London's governance, and they still exist today, their traditions rooted in this medieval practice. Another direct descendant of medieval livery was the uniform of household staff. As the great aristocratic houses of the 17th and 18th centuries grew larger and more formal, so did their staff. The butlers, footmen, and coachmen of a great house were dressed in elaborate uniforms. This was livery in its most literal sense. The uniforms were provided by the lord of the house, and they used his family's colors and crests. A footman standing at the door of a London townhouse was a direct visual successor to the medieval retainer guarding his lord's gate. The purpose was the same, to show the wealth and status of the master. The function had simply shifted from military and political to purely domestic. This tradition continued right up into the early 20th century, familiar to anyone who has seen a historical drama set in a stately home. The idea of livery also survived in more subtle ways. The uniforms of schools, for example, especially the traditional public schools of Britain, are a form of livery. They create a powerful sense of corporate identity and belonging among the students. The school crest is a modern-day livery badge. The old-school tie worn by alumni is a symbol of a lifelong affiliation, a network of connections, not unlike the affinity a medieval man felt for his lord's household. In the modern world, the principle of livery is all around us. The uniform worn by a soldier, a police officer, or a firefighter is a state-sanctioned livery, showing their allegiance to the public good rather than a private lord. The logo on a corporate polo shirt is a form of commercial livery, branding employees as members of a particular company. A sports team's jersey is perhaps the most passionate form of livery today. Fans wear the team's colors and logos to show their tribal loyalty, a feeling that a medieval retainer wearing his lord's colors as he marched into battle would have instantly understood. What began as a practical system for providing for followers in a world of shifting allegiances became the very fabric of feudal power. It was a source of security for the retainer and a symbol of strength for the lord. It was a uniform that could get you a hot meal, legal protection, or a knife in the ribs. It fueled private wars and threatened to tear the kingdom apart. But when that world faded, the core idea endured. It adapted to new contexts: trade, domestic service, education, and commerce. The medieval livery of color and badge is gone, but its spirit lives on in any uniform, logo, or jersey that we use to answer that fundamental human question: who are you with?